All right, so thank you all for listening to the spiel about our guidelines. Hello and welcome to today's session. I just want to move us back one slide. Today's theme is how to host a design jam. So if that's what you were looking for, you are in the right place. If that is not the session you were looking for, click around Whova and go find something else. My name is Chi Tam. My pronouns are she and her. I'm here today with Edge to host this conversation about the Community Innovation Challenges session on how to host the actual challenges that hopefully you all will take up in your local communities. That's the exciting element of this. Today's conversation is very literal and pragmatic to hopefully moving you forward to the next step of actually getting funding from us and getting this going wherever you are, or just as reference material for in future, whenever it's relevant to a work space or a project you're working in, please feel free to come back and reference this conversation as well, or get in touch with us. So first, it needs to be said that I am calling in from Toronto, and that's a very specific land context that we're working with in terms of social innovation. So I am, and we are all, I assume, please tell me if otherwise, I'd be very interested to know, settlers in what is currently known as Toronto, which is a word from Mohawk that means the place in the water where the trees are standing. And this is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, which includes the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, and many, many other nations, as it has been historically a very, very multicultural space way back when, pre-colonial times, and today. So it's always been a place of trade and interchange and ideas flowing back and forth. And I'm sure we wouldn't need to use or reference the term design jam, but I'm sure design jams have been happening in this place where the trees have been standing for a really long time to solve issues between human beings that have problems amongst each other in community. So I did want to connect that piece to our land acknowledgement because where I have had to use these skills, whether we use the fancy tech related terms like hackathons, et cetera, or if we just say it more bluntly as the typical relationship building skills we have in meeting with community and seeing where each others are at, these kinds of conversations, I find I'm able to very visibly have and struggle with the Chinatown community that I feel most bonded to in Toronto's context. And that's not a privilege that I feel is extended to urban Indigenous neighbors that I know are literally in the same neighborhood that I'm operating in and doing social innovation work in, who are, let's say, homeless against their will, who disproportionately are impacted by active cultural erasure and a loss of their languages and culture in this city. So that disparity makes me feel even more ambitious for how we approach this work. Like it makes it, I feel that it should give us more drive and make us want more for all of us together. So I invite you all into that same energy. That's what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about the land that I'm on. And if you're interested in learning more about the lands you're on, no matter where you are in the world, most of it has been mapped by now by the nativeland.ca project. So please feel free to log into that resource. It's a beautiful map to look at, actually. All right, so I will now introduce the folks in the room to each other. Jonathan, for context, is joining us as someone, a design jam enthusiast of late, let's say. So Jonathan has been historically an educator but pre-retiring and still continues that role very much so, it seems like, post-retiring. Let me just quickly mute that. Okay, so I'll read you out the rest of his bio. Jonathan volunteers his time organizing and participating in mapathons and hackathons related to sustainable development, and his interests include artificial intelligence, big data, machine learning, and the impact of digital technology on liberal democracy. He currently chairs the annual Go Open Data Hackathon and is actively engaged in using digital technology to support community outreach. His current focus is on what communities can do to adapt to and mitigate climate change. Hello, Jonathan. Do you want to say hi?
Hi there. Well, really pleased to be here, and I'm glad it's informal because I'm certainly not wearing an expert hat here. Although I will say I have some experience as both a participant in a hackathon, a mentor and a marker, and an organizer.
Lovely. I don't know what a marker means, so please remind me to ask you about that as the conversation goes.
Sure.
All right, and we also have with us Carla. Carla is currently the Director of Innovation at the United Church of Canada. Carla has an extensive background working in big for-profits like Coca-Cola Canada, McCain Foods, and the Canadian Pacific Railway, but 12 years ago decided to switch over and start a small business consulting business herself, and then pivoted it to what is now known as Small Business Solver. And that turned out to be extremely relevant to social innovation work. So over the last 9 years, Carla has built what we now know is United Church of Canada's portfolio of various huge social innovation portfolios. That includes the Buying United program, Embracing the Spirit, and this Social Innovation Challenge that you can find at socialinnovationchallenge.ca. Again, please check out the rest of this program. So that is where these two folks are coming into the conversation today. I wanted to check in with the chat and the rest of the participants who came by to see if you guys wanted to briefly introduce yourselves to each other. No pressure at all. Natasha. Okay, seems like Natasha's good for now. All right, and also is not at liberty to unmute for the meeting. So we'll just keep engaging with you through chat. All right, so I myself have never from top to bottom explained what exactly is a design jam. Like when we use this word hackathon, design jam, these things, what does it mean? What does it look like for someone who's never experienced one before? Jonathan, I'm willing to let you try to answer that first.
Okay, so just from a 30,000 foot level, like a general idea, I'm just thinking of my career when I worked at the Ministry of Education for 17 years. And before I arrived there, the way that policy was done was very different than when I left the ministry. And what had changed in between was this notion of user research and design thinking as big concepts. And I'm thinking, oh, well, what is this? So as I participated in lunch and learn sessions within the ministry, it came to me, okay, so what they're transitioning from is evidence-based decision-making. But before you know what the evidence is, you need to include those who are going to be impacted by the programs and services that are being designed by policymakers. So what I ended up doing is learning about journey mapping. And essentially what you do is you interview people that are accessing or will be accessing a service and find out where the pain points are, and to describe what they are thinking, what they are feeling, and what they are doing at each of those pain points. And then with that input up front, you can design a better delivery model, a better program. I mean, this is the concept, right? And so it's sort of that double loop feedback or the circular economy principles, that rather than fixing a problem downstream, you fix it upstream. So essentially that's how I understand design thinking. And what do you think, Carla? What's your experience?
No, I love your description of it. And I'd like to translate it differently. Like everything Jonathan said, I'd say yes. And then go, and so another way of thinking about that is, how do we walk in someone else's shoes? How do we understand someone else? How do we start to strengthen our own empathy and compassion muscles, right? And so in terms of the community development side, it's really those muscles. And I think moving into like, what does it actually look like? It really starts with like the space. So making space where everyone's voice matters, because what I find when the best ideas are formed, they're based on really understanding the journey map, like you were talking about, Jonathan. But the best ideas is because like everyone's voice was actually part of it. It doesn't matter who you are and what your background is. It doesn't matter anything. It's like being part of that discussion, it's going to be better. It's guaranteed, because you're going to have all these extra eyes and brains working in different ways on the same problem. And like sometimes when I'm just noodling around, I'm like, well, that's the answer. Then I'm like, no, it definitely isn't, because it's just my lens. And so I think the space, and like when she opened up the space today, here, that's like kind of the same feel that you want to have of this space. So I think it's making the space so you can actually do this hard work and hard thinking together.
Yeah, so let me bounce off that idea. So when she introduced it and did the acknowledgement, for example, I live in Coburg, and the Alderbrough First Nations, they are doing some amazing work. They have a solar farm, which is modern technology. And they also have what they call the Black Oak Savanna, which is a restoration of the Black Oak Savanna. And they have a center there, and they do outreach, or they have in the past. COVID sort of put that on hold in terms of field trips for students. But they also do research with Trent University, and they're using modern technology to try and figure out how to restore that land. And then more recently, we dedicated a painting by one of the elders, from Rick Bieber, and it's called White Pine Reflection. And it's got a beautiful acknowledgement for this area, unique to this area, rather than just going into a website and picking one out. Here it is, and it's a story that is not only a phrase, but it's a phrase that is embedded in this image of the white pine. Beautiful around Rice Lake. And so those are opportunities to understand the history of the place, but not just the history, but how the place is being sustained by the three pillars of sustainability, which is economic resilience, social responsibility, and environmental stewardship. And we have a lot to learn, and we need to listen to each other as we're learning what that looks like in a place that we're living in, not just in the digital canopy that seems to be covering the globe.
So let me ask you guys this then. What is the difference between a design jam in intention and just a regular community meeting to talk about each other's problems?
Well, that's a great question, because I think that when I talk to some of the neighborhood groups, for example, Gary Newman, he's a social worker. He works with gangs in Toronto and two neighborhoods up by Pearson Airport there. And he calls it community-based asset management, as opposed to asset management. So I don't know if you're familiar, we've got 211 is human services, 311 is government services, right? The pipes and if you've got a pothole to report it. And he said that one of the problems that he faces in terms of, bringing people together to talk about their problems is they really need to bring the community together to talk about their strengths. And I think this is where journey mapping comes in, because the concrete example he gave me was the Toronto corporate house came in and they cut the trees down so that the gangs couldn't hide behind the trees. So it removed line of sight. But those trees were used by the elders to communicate and work together and understand the community, to build community and maintain the community spirit. So by going in there and inadvertently, it's well-intentioned, we're looking at this problem, which is bigger than that community. But then when they go into that community, they're not adapting to the needs and the conditions within each of the individual neighborhoods in Toronto. And the same thing out here. So we get these huge initiatives where government wants to fix a problem. And for example, the police got $200,000 to put cameras up in downtown Coburg. Well, and this is supposed to fight gangs and guns. Well, we don't have gangs and we don't have guns in downtown Coburg, thank goodness. We have other challenges, but no, not those. So now when the government measures their success, they will say, well, we issued $18 million to all these different communities to fight gangs and guns. Well, that's not the story that policymakers are going to get, because the money has gone down into the wrong community for a different purpose. So the challenge is trying to be able to differentiate a need and then align it to the strengths within the community. And so I see a hackathon or a design jam as ability to do that. So you're not just going into problem solve or complain about our need or describe a need, because the needs are going to divide the community. But if you bring together and you say, okay, well, what are your strengths? And what is it that we have in common that we can work together on? Then I think you're gonna, have a more grassroots up, and then coming down, you're gonna get better support from the policymakers that put all the red tape into the reporting you have to do to monitor the outcomes from these initiatives.
Thanks, Jonathan. I'm going to try and make it a 1, 2, 3 based on what Jonathan just said, because absolutely, it really starts with the assets. So like, who are the people in the room who have gathered, and like, what are their gifts? What's the abundance? What are the assets? So I loved how you talked about that, Jonathan. Then I'd say number 2, well, actually adding to that, a lot of times it gets stymied because people are like, well, this person didn't show up. And so the people in the room, if you think about open space technology as well, the people in the room are the right people. You kind of have to start there of like who showed up. Number 2 is then the clarity on the problem. So you were talking, Jonathan, about gaps and like doing that matching. And so like, are we all understanding the problem the same way? And some of our previous conversations have been about like understanding our problem and prioritizing it. So some clarity around that. So we have awesome people in the room, great things. Here's the problem. And then the third step then would be, okay, now what's possible? And it doesn't have to be that you know, like quote unquote, solve whatever the joint problem was. That's probably not possible at the beginning, but you know, where could we start together based on everything here? So kind of 1, who's in the room, and be okay with that. They're the right people. Number 2, like, okay, we got this problem. We agree on what it is. Number 3, what is possible now? And I think you'll be amazed.
Yeah, and along those lines, there are different ways, just to go back to what is a hackathon. It really started out of the engineering and the agility methodology, they called it, and trying to promote entrepreneurship, like I said earlier. So it has that sort of geeky coding, technology, digital innovation component to it. It started in that environment, but it has very much breached out to include the human component. So you don't need to be a coder. In fact, it's kind of ridiculous to be focusing on coding because the machines are going to be doing most of the coding. It's more understanding what it is that you're working with. So all of the data the machines are crunching and looking for patterns, you need to understand, to be able to ground truth it, you need to be able to understand the information that you're bringing to the table. And so it's not a bad idea. The way that they develop the engineers, the way they work, you probably know the examples from campus where they put cars up on the roof and they do some really wacky things, but you sort of said, well, how do they do that? So it's that amazing work that can be done from sort of an engineer, or what we call STEM. But more recently, they've added the A, or the arts, to STEM, and it's called STEAM. And it's really interesting to see the conversation that you have when you bring people of different skill sets and different mindsets together to work on a particular project, or it might just be a jam saying, well, what is it? What is our need? If we don't know what we don't know, we can't sort of come up with a solution, which is what the engineers want to do. They want to go right into building a solution. So it's sort of to say, back up. And so what I see is, it's almost like, do you know the difference between, like, in the past, quantitative research and qualitative research? And you remember they used to sort of bang heads back in the 80s and the 90s. Oh, it's all about statistics. No. We have to bring in the story, the human component. It's qualitative research. And those two ships would be like passing in the night. Well, it's a little bit like that today when you look at engineering programs, the STEM programs, and the need now to bring in that human component. And so that's where like journey mapping and user design research comes in. I was down at the Austin, Texas annual event. And it's really all designers down there. And you would go around from one company to another, and they would do workshops. And it was amazing. I was down there for a wedding, so it was by accident that I stumbled on this design week, they called it. But very much, a whole lot of discussion around user design, profiling, who the different people are that would be using these services, and understanding it. But what I found more amazing is when you do that face-to-face.
And particularly over food.
Yes.
I would say, in my personal experience, my answer typically to someone who asks me like, oh, isn't that just like a fancy word for meeting? I would push back on that. Like, I think that don't underestimate the power in naming the meeting a design jam. Like, you're also presenting it, framing it and marketing, like kind of communicating the event a little bit differently to the community you're working with. And that primes everybody to come into the meeting with a slightly different attitude, with this attitude that we're going to take up the challenge together, that we're going to deliberately be generative and creative. And I think that that's still actually a helpful thing for people to reference, because I think there are people who are sort of rolling their eyes about this, and it's like, oh, like we're kind of over designing everything here. And I think that there actually still are very useful ideas that scaffold out of like all of this like hackathon language. However, I do think that if there are any snooty designer and tech-like people who hear about you genuinely making an effort in and hosting a challenge in your community, and they somehow like make you feel like you're not doing it properly, they are categorically wrong, because there is no like one way to do it properly. Like I would just like instill the confidence in anyone out there who is taking up the idea of like, I want to host an intentional jam session, a design charrette, a challenge, whatever you want to call it, a hackathon, to take that confidence to say like, there is no singular right way, and you know your community best. And don't let them step on your parade, you know?
Yeah. I love what you've just said about like the intentionality about this and the naming, because what we see is that every single day, what we do is we do linear thinking. So it's like, oh yeah, my task, I do this. But to do design thinking and to brainstorm requires non-linear thinking. So it's like, it's the brainstorming, but we're not used to it. When your brain doesn't have the muscles that way. So I love how you say, when we name it as a design jam, this actually frees our brain. And they have studies showing that literally the bigger your piece of paper that you have, the more creative that you are. Hence why, all the tech companies, they had those whiteboards and the white walls and all the time, because it actually allows you the freedom to think bigger. And that's what this space and what this time is all about, is thinking bigger. And I love your other thing is like, okay, so it's not done properly. Well, what does success look like? I think. So when I gave kind of the 1, 2, 3s, success is twofold. Like, the people in the room are the right people. So let's get to know them better and start that relationship. And no relationship starts at a run. All right, we talked about this in previous ones. How do you start crawling together? Just an experiment is good enough. So that brings me to the second, like success would be an experiment together. So like the relationships are success enough. But if you can actually figure out a way to experiment together, that's success as well. So I think sometimes we think, oh, it's a hackathon, it's a design jam, it's got to be this big thing, it's got to be a multi-million-dollar thing that comes out. No, it could literally be, I was talking in my last conversation with Chi, it could be a scavenger hunt on your main street. It doesn't have to be a big thing.
Yeah, well, I'm going to bounce off that by, you learn through your failures. So I'm going to share my failure. We did a consultation on, we had a major flood, a flood of 100 years, a century flood in 2017. And then we had another one in 2019 out here in Coburg. Toronto had one in 2013. And I'll talk about that later. But so we're in the library doing a session because we're going to provide input to the government on the Great Lakes Water Quality Initiative. Every 5 years they renew it. It's an agreement between the federal government and the provincial government, and then the federal government has a joint commission with the United States to better manage the Great Lake Basin. So, well, they weren't doing a very good job, but so we were sitting in the library and the mayor's there, the deputy mayor and a counselor, and Jonathan gets up and goes on the spiel about, what we need to do. And I'm talking sort of with my ministry hat on, and we could do this, and the deputy mayor is just scratching her head thinking, what planet is this guy from? So that's where I started out. But, rather than just saying, okay, well, I'm not going to do that anymore. I now have the task of restoring my trust and respectability with those counselors. And to do that, I have to work with other individuals. So it's, you're building a network. It's uncomfortable sometimes. You make mistakes. You have to be able to listen and to be able to learn from your mistakes and then try it out again. So that's sort of that whole notion of the iterative agility methodology, but it does take some courage because you're putting your own personality on the line too. And you're growing from it.
I love the idea of sharing more failures. So I would love to just hear some like concrete descriptions of like, what is the prep list? Like, what are the things, how big of a room do I need? Like, how does it have to have Post-it notes? Like, talk more in detail about the formats that you've seen fail and the formats that you've seen succeed. It's kind of in more like pragmatic terms, imagining that folks are writing up their to-do list right now as we speak.
Well, before I do that, Carla, can you describe some of the projects that have occurred with the funding that's available, just so that I have an idea of what a typical audience might be?
Yeah, it could be as simple as like park benches. We have like a food truck celebration thing that happens, and they just really got benches that were portable. So every Tuesday they could have like a food truck night and musicians for 300 people. There was a roving community dinner that happened. There was different types of transportation for more remote locations to get to hospitals and doctor appointments. There was a community garden that actually turned into a cafe eventually. There was like artist cabinets. Trying to think about different ones. We actually had one person who wanted to create a care B&B instead of an Airbnb. So it was basically for like, it would be like a Ronald McDonald houses where you basically can stay close to the hospital, but because it's so expensive when you're in remote places that they actually did like more of a fostering or a hostel type thing. And people's, well, care B&B, so Airbnb. That one didn't actually go because of liability concerns, but they turned it into this wild church meditation thing, which was cool too. So there's lots of different things that could come out of this. And so that's a good example of failure. Like they thought it was going to be care B&B. That's like, wasn't possible for various reasons, but they had the group of people who actually were about, you know, nature, and they like found another commonality that was totally different, that they ended up creating like a meditation circle in the woods. That's fine too.
Okay, that's great. So that helps me to understand sort of the context. So when you're organizing a hackathon, I mean, the first thing you have to think about is the challenges. It could be a challenge, or it could be a series of challenges, and then you go into breakout rooms. So concretely, what I've done here is work with the Durham region. Was the first one in 2018, and we did a mapathon. And I have a one-page agenda from that mapathon, and I connected with the GIS coordinator, and then he connected with the business developer and the program policy people, who then worked at their end to identify what the space was. And the space they chose was the Durham region offices. They have it's almost like a council room. So we used the council room that had the right equipment and the right size. Some people will use a school gym auditorium, or some people will use a school facility or a religious hall, for example. And in some communities, if they're privileged, they may have an innovation hub, and they'll have a space there that can be used. We have one here in Coburg called Venture 13. And so I volunteer with Sustainable Coburg, and we're sort of associated with the town of Coburg. So we get that space either free or at a very reasonable cost. So you want to find out what physical resources are available that are suitable for a hackathon. And you need to think about the space. You need to think about the internet connectivity, because you do need the internet for these, typically for a hackathon. And you need to think about catering. So food is very important. Of course, we haven't had food virtually. Most of the hackathons have been virtual during COVID. And we're looking forward to a hybrid mode, moving out of COVID. So food, the space, the outlets for plugging in, because typically the batteries don't last long enough. So you need to have sufficient outlets or extension cords. These are very practical things. And then mapping backwards from that, you need to do some background research on the particular challenge or the theme that you're going to be looking at. So for example, when we did the Durham region one, we had the staff who had a challenge from the health system. There was another one from the finance system. And another one was around mapping out assets from the rural communities in the Durham region. And then we brought in, then you have to know who you're going to invite to this if you're hoping to get an audience, because if you just put it out on social media, the chances are, unless you're savvy at using social media marketing, chances are you're not going to get the right audience, even though whoever you get, I agree, they're the right people. But I'm thinking locally, right? So if you're doing it, organizing it and meeting in a physical space, or even meeting people from a shared physical space that you're doing it virtually, it's important to be able to market it in a way that will grab their interest in participating. And you have to make sure that you're not using a lot of jargon. That's my problem. Just using hackathon, nobody understood it. The mayor didn't understand. Nobody understood it out here in little old Coburg, which is a town of 20,000 and growing. But over the years, it has improved. So marketing is a key thing, and you need to have a very simple brochure, like no more than a page or even half a page, who, where, what, when, and then get that out to as many channels as you possibly can. I would go in and talk to the principal in the local school. You build relationships with people in your community, and they begin to, the first time you come to a knock on the door and say, we're organizing this. We think your students might be interested, and it's a hackathon. And they sort of look at you, oh, okay. And then they say, okay, nice talking to you. And then you go out and nothing happens. And then you come back and, oh, you're here again. And after a while, they realize oh, you live down the street. Oh, you're not going to go away. This isn't a one-off. So you begin to, you bend their ear, and then eventually they say, well, he's not going to go away. So you're going to have to deal with him. So maybe there's a staff member I know, and I'll refer this over to that staff member. And if you're lucky, you'll get a staff member that then will take it and run with it. That was the case with the Durham region. There was a Cracker Jack guy, Brock and Baker, and he was fantastic at connecting with the teachers and with the students. I didn't have that capacity. He did. And he also had the capacity to organize the buses and the funding that was available to the schools to organize the buses to take them to the Durham region. Well, that worked out fantastic. And we've actually recorded with and he also got the written permission to record the event and get the student feedback, which I can share. I have a link of the students. It's fantastic, the students talking about the feedback. And so marketing is a key thing, and having the right people doing that marketing. Because if you think you can just do it all on your own as one organization, chances are you're going to be going back to that door, knocking on that door again and again and again, and not getting anybody coming out of that organization to help you market. So marketing with help from your friends, a little help from your friends is important. So I've talked about the place, the internet, the food, the marketing. Carla, do you want to share?
Oh, totally. I was like, I'm going to take a slightly different approach on the communications, but totally what you said too, where it's like, the direct invites are so important, especially with the language around Design Jam or hackathons, is that for each person you're speaking to, how do you translate it for them? Yeah. Right? So what is something that feels comfortable for them? So understanding where they're coming from, because it can be intimidating, and just being like really affirming that this is for you. This is actually a place where your voice is going to matter and you're actually going to make a difference here. So really positioning it that way. Another thing is that the people who show up with ideas, there's a certain type of person who shows up because they like sharing their ideas. And then there's a certain type of person who's really committed. And so I think what's important in inviting people is remembering that like you're going to have both people show up. And so a good part to remember at the end of the Design Jam is like, what does commitment look like? Like, who's actually going to lead this? Who's actually going to volunteer? And I think that at the end of any of these Design Jams, I'm always shocked about who actually puts their hand up. It might actually be the quietest person in the room, right? It might actually be someone that you're not expecting. And we typically like to see like 3 leaders evolve from this. And it should, because they showed up about a problem they're passionate about. Other problems, because you were asking, like, the problem is when people make their problem too big. It's so big that like they can't grapple on where to start. And sometimes if your problem's too small, it's not generative enough of beauty. Like, so kind of having a nice medium-sized problem that you're chewing on is good. Another big thing that's a problem when people show up when they already have the solution. Like if they have their own agenda, and also what's tied to that, which is a huge red flag, is an ego. So if they have an agenda, which is often tied with their own ego, it's like, how are you still ensuring that the space, like that everyone understands what this space is? And that actually having like an idea already is not going to move us forward. Then the positive things, because I think you're like, what's the bad things? I did the bad things, but moving into positive things is when you have a small win. So like after, like, this is going to be fun. This is going to be a good time together. So at the end of that, you want to keep the momentum going. So being like, okay, so when's our next meeting? Or what's the next step? And having like head noddings on that. Having lots of different people every time, like we've had these with like 7-year-olds to 85-year-olds in the same room. And like, that's just so great. Like in terms of diversity, and like all types of diversity are very important. It's just going to make it for better conversations. And then my last thing that's really important is going with the energy, like don't force it, right? So I think that's why I like to start with a one-on-one invite of saying why it's for them. And then like some people are going to feel more committed or not. And it's not just following the energy. Sometimes it's like this, and sometimes it's like this. And I think both are okay. And it doesn't mean the idea is a bad idea. It just means that maybe now is not the right time.
Yeah, I guess the other thing is you need to respect people's time. And you need to respect the fact that if you're asking people that are working full time, that they may be doing this at the side of their desk. They may be passionate about it, but it's still at the side of their desk. And they may not show up all the time. They may not reply to your emails all the time. So you need to understand when you're emailing them that you don't, spam them inadvertently. When you're setting up a committee to get people involved, you may not get everybody attending at every meeting, and give yourself a lot of lead time, and do take good notes with these action items. And if people don't show up, then there's some continuity. They can see sort of the story unfolding on the back end. And then that leads to having good success when you actually pull the event off. And to do that, you need some detailed people. I'm an ideas guy. So I know that my strength is that, and it's not in details. So I always try and find somebody who's good on the detail and feels comfortable dealing with the details. So honoring the different skill set and knowing that if you're chairing it or if you're leading it, that different people are going to step forward at different times to make it a successful planning process. So I would add that to it as well. Carla, what do you think?
I wanted to jump onto that last point because everything you guys said have totally mirrored my experiences as a teenager, getting invited as like a student, being pitched to come to these things that people really wanted us to participate in, and now seeing like being the host of some of these and seeing what works. I think there is always a tendency for the host, the chair, the person who brings the people together to try and commit to those next to-do list items, or like, when should we meet next? Who should do the next action item? And like, as much as that is extremely tempting, and as much as you may feel at the end of the meeting, like if you don't say you'll do that follow-up task, nothing will happen, do not do it. Leave that space, just leave it alone, leave that space. Let it marinate out there, because if you step up to do that, it is first of all not sustainable for you, but also it was not the point of the entire challenge. The entire point was for you to like foster people to step up from all corners of the community. And you can let that languish, honestly. You can just let that empty task that is unassigned sort of sit out there in the air, in the community, still keep them connected to each other, still remind people that no one has stepped up for it, but do not insert your name into it. I think that is like one of the key things of hosting one of these hackathons that I have seen happen over and over again. It's just like the hosts continuing to be the people who propel the whole entire response to the challenge for the duration of the program. So
yeah,
I just really wanted to double down on it.
No, because I think that the end and where you leave is so critical. And so, yes, huge yes to what you just said. And like, how do you close it out? And so when we're chatting about what is success, right? Success is like the relationships, and success is a small experiment or whatever that thing is. So to end, like the relationships are actually everything. And so thinking about how do you close and like have everyone see each other and feel heard and be heard. We have oftentimes done a bubble of like a word of appreciation. When we're face to face, pre-COVID, we would take a ball of yarn and throw it at each other and like actually spank an individual. And then they would throw it, and then we would have this network, like a web that we've actually created across. And it's beautiful that like you could be the loudest person in the room, you could have had like the best idea, you could have contributed the most or the least or whatever happened in there. Everyone was there and you added to it. And so this like web of appreciation is like a really nice way to wrap it up. And that's the point, not like she says, you taking the next action.
Yeah. Well, there's two things. One, yeah, I think it's important to keep the momentum going during the day, and you need like a motivator, as well as some activities to break it up for mental health reasons, because you can't just, be hacking away for like, typically it's a weekend, right? So the last hackathon I participated in was called Together versus the Virus. And we had 8 people from across Canada. We didn't know each other. On a Friday, we formed a team, and then we had to do something and then do our pitch on Sunday. And it's important. You can't, like, certainly at my age, I can't do an all-nighter, and you can't expect others to do that as well. It's not, and we don't want to promote that, especially with youth who tend to think about doing all-nighters. And so anyhow, that's the other thing, is the MC, some activities that break up the actual tasks that they're working on, building a prototype, and making sure that you have that food there, that they're looking after their mental health, and not just sort of thinking how great it is that they can do an all-nighter.
I'm going to read out a huge point that has come in through the chat. From Natasha, I'm just thinking about some of the community events I've helped host, and one of the big things that good hosting has focused on is how the environment sort of subliminally affects who shows up. So there are these cues you pick up, and an example here is a conference at a university, but because it was physically at a university, that's like sometimes is a detriment to making everyone feel welcome. So there was a lot of work that had to be done to like make it very clear that it was a space open to all, no matter your education level, and it really was a community event. So the host developed a dress code very cleverly that would work to make it feel welcoming for everyone, from farmers to CEOs that would be convening together as part of this design jam. And I love that. I love that point so much. And you can think of, like, again, your community best. So you can think of like little interventions like that are so literal, but actually have like a bigger atmospheric impact on your hosting. Totally. Oh, Natasha, you volunteered to speak to it. I'm so sorry that I spoke over it. Did you want to add anything? I just saw that addition.
No, that's okay. My husband's meeting's done, so I can talk now. Yeah, it was, just as I was listening, I think one of the biggest things, so yeah, I mean, I've done several things like this, but this one conference in particular was about fracking, and it was in Alberta, so a little bit of a loaded topic. And we had everybody from farmers who could set their water on fire, to academics, to government officials, to the like chief engineer for Indian Oil and Gas Canada, like all ranges of people coming and trying to create an but we really wanted it to be collaborative, and we had roundtable conversations was the central piece in this particular conference. But how do you have all of these people who are diametrically opposed on so many things come and have conversation and be in a nurturing environment together? So yeah, so we had to think about how our wording in terms of inviting people to a campus. There was challenges around that in terms of how we dressed. We had a bunch of community volunteers home make cookies, and we had baskets of cookies on each table to try to like simulate that dining room table thing. They brought, like, we had all these senior ladies and they were amazing, brought all their different home tablecloths to try to simulate that environment of being in a round, and it was all round tables intentionally. So being at a round table, being at that dining room table, having that environment to put people at ease. Just all the steps that we took to try to make it feel as sort of homey and safe as possible, because we knew that it was going to be a very challenging conversation. And I think when you're addressing social issues or coming together to try to work out issues, it can be very challenging if you have all of the players at the table. And so how do you do that? And that was one of the solutions that we came up with. And I have to say, I was shocked with how well it worked. And it went on to be a conference for 6 years, looking at different issues. But and then there was other conferences that started mimicking that afterwards. But it was hard. Like, how do you bring all these people together and make it and you can never really make it a safe space, but how do you make it a brave space for people to be in?
So Natasha, that lasted 6 years. What maybe you could speak to the collaborative tools that you use to provide the continuity or the continuation of that collaboration, because one of the critiques of hackathons is that they're like a flash in the pan. You have the hackathon plateau and it doesn't really have an impact on, it doesn't go to scale. It doesn't really have an impact in the community or on an enterprise organization. So maybe you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah, a bit. I mean, I wasn't one of the key organizers. I was, as you're talking about the people that do the logistics, I'm good at that. So it was making sure that the cookies were where they were supposed to be at what time and making sure the sound quality was good. That was my side of it, but I had a bit to do with some of the other parts. And part of what helped, and so being in a university, this is a bit of a different context, but if you engage a local university in your project, you could possibly have something similar happen. This was the liberal arts campus of the U of A in Camrose, Augustana. So liberal arts campuses sometimes are a little more open to this. But the way we sort of built on that momentum was for the following, I can't remember if it was 5 or 6 years. I think the last year didn't have it, but there was a course in the fall semester that was associated with this conference. And this particular course was open to both students who could sign up, but community members could attend for free as long as they brought their life experience and were willing to host conversations from different small groups in their homes. And so they were allowed to come and learn and to be part of this, but they didn't have to pay the money, but they had to have other social contracts, right? And the community was on board with that. So we had lots of people like that. And then as a class, the class would help host the conference. And so it'd be both the community members and the students. And of course, the prof and the leadership team sort of spearheaded things, but everybody was involved in ensuring that it was a success. The other cool thing is everybody has different networks. So all of the students, all the different community members would invite people to come. And so we addressed lots of different societal challenges. So things like basic income, reconciliation work. We did a lot around that. Environmental safety. So like one of them was caring for all creation. So having everybody from farmers who had gone from conventional farming to changing to more eco-conscious farming to Ducks Unlimited to come talking about protecting our riparian areas and things like that. Like depending on the year, there's a different theme each year, and we're addressing different aspects of challenges in the community. And I really do think having the built-in core group of a class made it much more sustainable, but it also became something that people looked forward to every year. So people because I grew up in Calgary, and I would send invitations out, and people would drive up from Calgary and looked forward to it every year. And I know people had friends in Edmonton or different parts that would come. And we actually had, in our first conference, we had people that even came from Australia. We had people from all over. And so it was just building on the network of the people that were there. And so if you can partner with a high school, a university, somewhere where you have that built-in core group that comes with their own network, I think is huge for having that sustainability piece. And if it's something that you can build into, say, a conference or some kind of an annual event, if there's some education component or something where you can bring people together like that people can look forward to and you can build up to each year, I think that can really help with the sustainability piece as well.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I really like that example. Maybe you can
Perfect.
send me the link because they're actually getting marks for this course. It's free for the community, but the students are getting marks. I don't like to include and to emphasize the need for marks to motivate students. It shouldn't be that at all, but it unfortunately does.
But it doesn't hurt.
It doesn't hurt. That's a good way to put it.
And Carla also
pointed out
commented that
cookies.
they come for the cookies as well.
If you feed them, they
the
will come.
food, the marks. I mean,
Yeah.
the prizes.
We would also have a meal each week with the class that different
Oh,
groups
that's
would
cool.
make.
Yeah.
So
That's huge, actually.
yeah. So it's neat.
Perfect.
Cool.
Your example concretely touched on so many of the sort of abstract principles that we tried to bring forward. And I feel like your example demonstrated the importance of partnerships, et cetera, et cetera. So again, just because the whole point of this is that I'm trying to plug for people to actually do a CIC, if you don't feel like you know where to turn to, we are super connected. So once you fill out an expression of interest, we can help you brainstorm who to connect to. Let's talk, let's chat, and let's jam together, maybe.
Hey, can I just ask Natasha?
Oh, yeah.
So I've done some collaborative research projects with post-secondary, right? They're called capstone projects, or it might be a PhD student working on something, or a postgraduate certificate program. But the one professor at Trent, they have a learning management system, which is kind of deadly. These learning management systems are, for students, they don't like it. Anyhow, that's how these courses are developed. Well, then he thought, well, I don't like this, so let's try Microsoft Teams. But then the barrier, if I wanted to involve the community or high school students, well, they don't have the login and stuff. So there's this ridiculous fragmented collaborative space, right? The technology has fragmented that digital collaborative space. So maybe I don't know if you were part of it or understood how they did it, what tools were they using and how did they overcome that fragmented space for collaboration?
Yeah, so this would have been, we started in 2012, I think. So it's 2012 was our first year. So the technology was a bit different then. But also I think partly being in a rural context, it was a lot of traditional media and person-to-person networking that was used, at least initially. So we put ads in the newspapers in the area. We went and set up booths at the farmers markets. We went and did presentations in the gym in the high school to get some of the high school students engaged. So it wasn't a tech heavy thing. To continue the engagement, we did have a student who was also studying film and who filmed all of the conferences, and then we put it on YouTube after, I believe it was. So I think at the time, it wasn't a tech heavy process. It was very much an in-person, person-to-person connecting process in that context. Since then, I've done more, and through Edge, I've been part of a number of things. And so platforms like Huva, I find are interesting, though I have found with some of my senior congregants, the way you have to log in can be a challenge or a barrier. So being able to use a platform that more people are familiar with, so Zoom or like live streams on Facebook, that seems to be a relatively low barrier method as well, that reaches wide audiences. It's interesting sort of that when there's a lot of barriers involved when you start involving technology, and I mean, there's always barriers, but how do you link that? And so, I mean, I would suggest finding a common platform that isn't log independent, but of course, like you said, if you're getting graded on things, sometimes you have to work within certain platforms, but
there's nothing that beats in person. I will wrap up with a short example of something we did recently, which is that even though everyone still had to dial into Zoom, we did send out coupons on various digital food ordering services for people to be able to at least eat at the same time during a jam, and that seemed to work well. If anybody is strapped for ideas out there. We are closing close to the hour, so I do want to close the space now. And of course, we will stay connected. But if any of you all want to connect to this group, either literally to Jonathan and Carla and I and Shasha, or more broadly to the Community Innovation Challenge, please feel free to fill in that Google form on the socialinnovationchallenge.ca website. And we can connect from there. Even if you don't feel like you have all the answers for it, just fill it out first and we'll talk.